You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the Unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're back for episode 2 about the Route 29 Stalker. And Mr. Thomas, it's time for a quiz.
Just like that? You didn't give me the answer in advance. All right, what's the quiz?
Mr. Thomas, where is Route 29 located?
Route 29 is located, it's stretching from Florida to Virginia, based on your notes that I had studied earlier and memorized very carefully. Am I correct?
To Maryland, but that's okay.
Okay, that's pretty close. With that,
Yep.
I didn't cheat. I didn't look at the notes. And now that I am looking at the notes again, Route 29 stretches 1,036 miles from Florida to Maryland.
And why are we concerned about Route 29 today, Mr. Thomas?
Because we're trying to start on an upbeat note before we get back into the serious business of discussing the Route 29 Stalker case. As we had discussed in last week's episode, we are now beginning to narrow the discussion to the cases that we think probably do belong under this moniker of the Route 29 Stalker. As we discussed last time, many cases over the years, some of which happily have been solved, were linked at least for a time to the Route 29 Stalker cases, which unfortunately all remain unsolved at this point. Perhaps Kate Miles' new book, Trailed, may lead law enforcement and other concerned parties to take another look at some of these cases, which would be a fantastic outcome. Now we begin to focus on the cases that we think are core to what we call the Route 29 Stalker case.
Those are the cases of Alicia Showalter Reynolds, whom we briefly discussed last time, Thelma Scroggins, and Anne McDaniel. Main core of the Route 29 Stalker killings took place in and around a town called Lignum, which the Daily News leader from Stanton, Virginia, calls a rural crossroads of only 6 houses and a post office. It also describes it as a hamlet, which I think we were deciding that last time is about the smallest that a town can get is a hamlet.
Yes, I think if you are too small to be a village, then I think you become a hamlet.
I like the reporting from the Daily News leader in Stanton that also said this. All 3 cases apparently involve a trusting woman and a mysterious killer. I think it's a pretty good way to characterize it. So all of these took place in and around Lignum, which is a rural crossroads, only 6 houses and a post office. It is about 20 miles west of Fredericksburg, and it contains farmhouses, an abandoned store, a post office, which is actually a 2-room trailer, which is all next to a hayfield. This is really just a blip on the radar. It's a bump on the map. And Anne McDaniel's, Alicia Showalter Reynolds, and Thelma Scroggins were all found in that area, which is why several investigators have posited that they are all the work of the same killer. Let's jump into these 3 murders, all of which took place during 1996. In March of 1996, we have that murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds, age 25. Alicia was from Baltimore, or she was based in Baltimore when she was going to Johns Hopkins for her master's work. And she was driving on her way to Charlottesville to meet with her mother so that they could go shopping for dresses for her brother's wedding. Unfortunately, she never made it to the mall where her mother was eagerly waiting for her. Instead, we have those eyewitness reports that placed Alicia peering under the hood of her car, her little white Mercury Tracer, and then climbing into a dark pickup truck with someone who appeared to be helping her. although I very much doubt that's what he was trying. Her car was found 3 miles outside of Culpeper. It had that white napkin under the windshield, which signals car trouble. She was gone without a trace until she was found 2 months later in May of that same year, covered in brush off of a seldom used gravel trail about 15 miles from her car.
One of the things I noticed in reviewing some of the other reporting on her disappearance was beyond Alicia Showalter Reynolds being a no-show to meet her mother to go dress shopping, there were reports that her credit card had been found dropped on the street in Culpeper, which obviously was a signal that at minimum she had lost her credit card. And that the beginning of the mystery of her disappearance. She's not there to meet her mother. Her credit card is found, and then she seems to disappear only to be found 2 months later.
And in that intervening time is when women started coming forward to police and said, oh, there was a guy who stopped me on the road. Mm-hmm. He said my car was malfunctioning, but it wasn't. There was nothing wrong. And of course, when police looked at Ms. Reynolds' mercury tracer, there was nothing wrong with it. Everything was completely fine. So she was apparently taken in by the ruse of this Good Samaritan who took her and ultimately murdered her. Last year, there was coverage of the 25th anniversary of her disappearance and murder. As of yet, 25 years on, her family still has no answers.
I've had some lengthy conversations with the Showalters, Mr. and Mrs. They've had a number of disturbing things to say about how the Virginia State Police have handled this investigation. I know that I've spoken to Sadie Showalter on a number of occasions over the years, and they have been extremely critical of the way the Virginia State Police have handled this investigation and kind of shockingly how adversarial VSP detectives have made the relationship with the Showalter family, particularly the parents. The Virginia State Police seem obsessed with any public comment that Sadie and her husband Harley Showalter have made, particularly anything that's critical of the pace of the investigation. As the brother of a murder victim, your frustration builds when there's no communication from your law enforcement investigators, when you're hearing nothing and receiving no updates, and then anniversary dates are coming, media requests are made, and you're being asked questions about what's the latest in your daughter's disappearance and murder. It's very difficult not to tap into that reservoir of hurt and struggle to maintain a positive attitude for these family members. Sadie has told me some stories that just curled my hair about how rude and antagonistic these investigators were, including senior people at the Virginia State Police attacking them. I think the way they've handled this case has been completely lacking, and I think their relationship with the Showalter family has just been horrible, and I will publicly call them out on this. I'll add that several years ago when we received tips that tied into the Route 29 Stalker case, at least potentially, I'd been approached by a woman who felt that her estranged husband could be involved, and she provided highly credible information regarding her husband and the behaviors that she had witnessed. He fit the physical description. There's a sketch, which is well known, that's appeared in Virginia media for years, of the man they think could be responsible for the Route 29 Stalker case. And I will say this guy looked remarkably like the sketch. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, I approached the Virginia State Police in the most respectful manner possible with this information, and it was a mighty struggle to get the investigators to return calls, follow up. It got so frustrating that the original tipster, the woman that had approached me with concerns about her estranged husband, and as I said, she provided a tremendous amount of detail, much of which lined up with what they said they were looking for in the Route 29 Stalker case. I'm not saying this man is responsible, but when she gave me as much detail as she did, and I passed all of this on to the investigators, it was so frustrating for them to just come up with every excuse under the sun. Oh, I have to go next week for training. Oh, I don't have time to follow up on this. Oh, she didn't return my calls. And then in the meantime, the woman that had approached me because of our visibility with the Colonial Parkway murders grew increasingly frustrated because she said, can't you get someone from the Virginia State Police to contact me and come and see me, and I'll give them this information about my ex-husband. I do not think this woman was crazy. I do not think she was just trying to settle a score with her estranged husband. She really was afraid of him, and she was afraid he was involved. I'm not an expert on all things Route 29 Stalker, but he checked a lot of boxes in this case, and even driving similar vehicles. And I remember actually challenging the investigators. He was talking to me about the vehicles, and I said, that's not what you guys said in 1996. And he said, well, how do you know? And I said, because I went back and read the newspaper articles. And at the time, your predecessors, I know this particular investigator wasn't handling the investigation all those years before. I get that. But I thought to myself, am I the only one that has any sense of history of this case? Because he said, oh, we're looking for this particular type of pickup truck. And I said, wait a minute. Your predecessor said publicly with photographs in the such and such a newspaper in 1996, 1997, that you're looking for the kind of pickup truck you're describing to me, a dark blue Ford Ranger or Mazda pickup truck, as well as a green Nissan pickup truck with these very distinctive zigzag gold decorations on the side of the truck, which were extremely distinctive. And he said, I don't know where you get that. And I said, from the newspaper. And just the amount of foot dragging and excuses that I received, to the point where this woman grew frustrated with me because it didn't seem like I could get the Virginia State Police to do their jobs, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. It was very frustrating. And so I feel like I got just a little taste of the kind of attitude that Sadie and Harley Showalter had told me about. I don't know how murder victims' families become the enemy in the minds of some people in law enforcement, but the Virginia State Police has failed the Showalter family without question.
Wow. Just awful. Following that March 1996 murder and the discovery in May of Alicia's body, you have the July 1996 murder of Thelma Scroggins. There is not a lot of information about Thelma, unfortunately. Up until I started doing my own deep dive on the case, I had never heard her name publicly associated with the Route 29 Stalker case. So this was a bit of a surprise to me. Thanks to some very astute researchers who had clipped some articles from newspapers.com about this murder, I was able to learn a little bit about Thelma Scroggins. So Thelma Scroggins, 74, was found murdered in her home in Lignum on July 14th, which happens to be my dad's birthday, after she failed to show up to church where she was the organist on Sunday. Friends, of course, went to go look for her, and when they arrived at her home the next morning after church, they found that she had been shot to death, shot in the head. A friend who had been talking to her on the phone the previous night reported that she had said she needed to end the conversation because someone was knocking on her door and she needed to answer it. And I can only assume that whoever was knocking on her door is probably the person who killed her. It seems like the most obvious thing to me. But unfortunately, she was found shot in the head, and there have been no arrests in her case. Her home is actually directly across from the post office. So if you can say that there is a center of Hamlet, center of life in Lignum, it would be right there at the post office. And her house was immediately across from it.
When I read about Thelma Scroggins' murder in Lignum, it occurred to me that, yes, there's a significant age difference. Ms. Scroggins was 74 years old. Alicia Showalter Reynolds is 25. So they seem outside the age range that we often see in other serial killings. Two quick thoughts. One is that our profiler friends have told us that you can't lock into these ideas that there is a type necessarily with a serial killer. Sometimes serial killers will lash out for other reasons. It may be a crime of opportunity, or when I first heard of Thelma Scroggins, perhaps in this very small town where she lived in, she might have seen something. It took some time, for example, for the killer of Alicia Showalter Reynolds to figure out where Thelma Scroggins lived, and or a conversation took place where Ms. Scroggins indicated that she might have information about the Showalter Reynolds murder. And that might be enough of a triggering event to cause a killer to lash out at her and eliminate her as a potential source of information. So she's a traditional crime victim. It could be something completely random, or there may be a tie-in into the March 1996 murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds.
Very well could be. Again, wouldn't have occurred to me. You're on it today, sir, but I think that's because I am tired and ready for spring break.
That's a separate issue.
Yes, it is. And finally, we get to the September 1996 murder of Carolyn McDaniel, who was 20 years old. McDaniel had been living in a group home for physically and developmentally disabled adults in the President Madison in Orange, Virginia. And Orange is also a pretty small town, and it is about 25 miles from Lignum. McDaniel said she was going out to meet a mystery date that evening and ultimately disappeared without a trace. Her body was found 4 days later in Culpeper County near Lignum, and an even smaller town called Mount Pony. And she was found by some men who were out exercising their dogs in the woods. Cause of death on Ann McDaniel was asphyxiation, and her body was badly burned. In fact, it was only through use of dental records that her body was able to be identified. Her remains were actually found only 5 miles from the location where Alicia Showalter Reynolds had been found in May. So there is a very direct connection between Alicia and McDaniel.
A couple of observations on Carolyn McDaniel. One of the things that I was very struck by was that Ann McDaniel had some development issues. Pretty convinced that Samantha Clark did as well. When I first was reading about Ann McDaniel some years back, I thought to myself, I wonder if she could have been a victim of Randy Taylor, who was sometimes looking for young women that might not be able to have the sophistication to understand that his goals were less than stellar.
Yeah.
It occurred to me that Ann McDaniel could be a victim of someone like Randy Taylor. Now, certainly the proximity in terms of where Ann McDaniel's remains were found and those of Alicia Showalter Reynolds, only 5 miles apart. And again, these are in very small rural Virginia towns. There's certainly a potential relationship there. But the Randy Taylor possibility is one that has stuck with me for all of these years.
Understandably so, I think.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
So are those 3 cases linked? I think it seems very likely that they are. And Bill, I think you're on that same team with me, correct?
I am. And certainly the Alicia Showalter Reynolds case ties into those perhaps as many as 20 different female motorists who mentioned that they were pulled over by this man who flagged them down, usually driving a pickup truck and gesturing that there was something wrong with their car. There is a woman who survived an assault from this man. She said that she had been pulled over by this man and that she was riding along in his pickup truck and he lunged at her with a screwdriver, if I'm not mistaken. She managed to extricate herself from the vehicle. She said that he referred to himself by the name of Larry Breeden. Breden, we think. And there was a great deal of research looking for Larry Breeden or some similar name, but she gave law enforcement investigators a very good physical description of the man and the pickup truck he was driving, and it's her ability to escape this man's clutches that resulted in the sketch, which has so long been associated with this case. And of course, we'll include the sketch in our social media and in our podcast notes.
For those keeping track, we have covered the cases of the women who have been murdered by serial killers, namely Jesse Matthew, Randy Taylor, and Mark Evanitz. We've covered crimes that probably fall underneath the Route 29 Stalker umbrella. And now we are going to cover crimes that happened outside of the Route 29 geographic area, but are still murders of women that have gone unsolved. So here we go with that final category. And so the two cases that we want to talk about are the case of Julie Williams and Laura Lolly Winans. Because we are going to have our friend Kate Miles on the podcast in the not too terribly distant future, we are going to save most of the content about Julie Williams and Lolly Winans for her. This is the case that she has been so heavily involved with, and she has done such an amazing job doing research for. But just to give you a quick sketch of this information, the Julie Williams and Lolly Winans case is also known as the Shenandoah murders. There may be some links to the Colonial Parkway murders as well. Bill, I'll let you get into that in just 1 second. In May of 1996, Julie Williams, 24, and Laura Lolly Winans, 26, were camping in Shenandoah National Park. These are women who were very familiar with the outdoors. They spent a lot of time camping, a lot of times hiking. They were murdered inside the Shenandoah National Park near a place called Skyland, which, even though I have lived here my entire life, I have never been to. There are some pretty distinct similarities to their murder case and the case of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Would you like to go into that, Bill?
Sure, we'll cover the basics. Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski are an outdoorsy, athletic, lesbian couple killed in a national park in October 1986. In May 1996, a very similar couple, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans, are also murdered in a national park. Now, it's 10 years later and about 180 miles distant. They're within the same state, Virginia, but they're not exactly next door to each other. So it's 3.5 hours, Kristin, would you say?
Yeah, just about. Actually, maybe a little less than that. I can probably get to Charlottesville in about 2.5 hours if I speed, which I never would.
No, never.
No.
Similarities? The FBI admitted publicly and repeatedly in 1996 that they were exploring the similarities between Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski's murder with the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. There are a few other boxes we probably need to check here. In addition to the lesbian outdoor couples killed in a national park, they're both killed on 3-day weekends. Julie and Lolly were killed over Memorial Day weekend, 1996. Kathy and Becky were killed over Columbus Day weekend, 1986. They are similar in that Julie and Lolly were restrained with some sort of binding and their throats were slashed. There doesn't seem to be any sexual assault or robbery motive in either of the two lesbian couples. There are these substantial similarities, and that's the expression the FBI used in 1996. Both sets of murders, Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans, remain unsolved. They've both been investigated by the FBI because they happened inside national parks by separate FBI offices. The Norfolk and Newport News office in the Kathy and Becky example, the Richmond office in the Julie and Lolly example. There has been a great deal of coordination between the two field offices, as they're called, at the Bureau. The idea that these two sets of women and their murders could be related does not seem to be an idea that's in favor at this point with the FBI, but it was certainly something that was discussed. One of the areas that was explored, and I don't know that it was fully resolved, at least to my family's satisfaction, is that there are 4 National Park Service rangers who were working at the Colonial Parkway in 1986 who were assigned to the Shenandoah National Park in 1996, some 10 years later, including one ranger who was a person of interest in the Colonial Parkway murders in 1986, who somehow, and somewhat bizarrely, I would add, was permitted to be one of the lead investigators in the Julie Williams and Lolly Winans murder investigation, which I find completely unacceptable. How a person of interest in a substantially similar case, I'm going to use the FBI's wording here, from 1986 would be permitted to not just participate, but be a lead investigator in a substantially similar murder 10 years later. I question the judgment of the FBI and the Virginia State Police in this regard.
I do too. 100%. Now, we don't want to steal Kate's thunder by giving any more information about this case because she is going to come and talk about her terrific book. I am, of course, reading it right now. And she has a lot of great information that I know she's going to want us to keep under our hat until she can reveal it to you.
And she's a terrific writer, and we cannot recommend Trailed, her new book coming out May 3rd, enough. If the book is out, you absolutely should pick up a copy. We're both really enjoying it.
I think that our next true crime bookshelf should lead off with Trailed, for sure.
Fair enough.
It's wonderful. And so finally, the other case of a murdered woman, and this is a woman who has not yet been recovered, is the murder of Sage Smith. And Sage Smith did not take place during the 1996 timeframe. In fact, her murder happened presumably in 2012. Again, she has not been found, so we do not know what precisely has happened to her. But Sage Smith is a 19-year-old transgender woman from Charlottesville who was working at a hair salon and was an aspiring hairdresser. She was last seen in Charlottesville in November of 2012, getting ready to go on a date with a man by the name of Eric McFadden, 29 years old. Sage Smith was last seen walking to the Wild Wings Cafe, which is next to the Amtrak station in Charlottesville near the downtown mall. Incidentally, the downtown mall is the last place where Hannah Graham was seen or would be seen in 2014. Sage Smith was walking to meet McFadden and ultimately did not arrive and has never been seen since. Eric McFadden is the only person of interest in her disappearance. McFadden never actually showed up for his meeting with Charlottesville police. He skipped town, has since disappeared, presumably off the face of the earth. No one has heard from him. His family has not heard from him. Nothing. Like the man has utterly vanished. There is currently a $20,000 reward being offered for information leading either to the recovery of Sage Smith remains or leading to information that will lead to the arrest of Eric McFadden, who is the only person of interest in her disappearance.
I am rock solid convinced that Eric McFadden is responsible for the murder of Sage Smith. Now, they met through Craigslist Casual Encounters, which is admittedly a place where sex workers often meet Johns. And I'm not sure if McFadden knew that Sage Smith was transgender. I am highly confident that a meeting did take place that evening. They texted on and off that evening. I think a meeting did take place. I think things went south for whatever reason. Perhaps McFadden discovering that Sage Smith was not exactly what he thought he was getting into. I believe that Eric McFadden is still out there somewhere. I think he killed Sage Smith, disposed of her body, and blew town. It's a shame that somehow McFadden has never turned up again. I think an in-depth search for Eric McFadden would probably find him out there somewhere living under a new name, having murdered Sage Smith, brutally disposed of her body, and escaping justice. And I think this is such a tragedy. I find the whole thing so disturbing.
I mean, reading the reporting about Sage Smith and her sad disappearance and murder, I was really struck by the fact that her murder ended up being overshadowed, really, by the fact that Hannah Graham disappeared later in November of 2014. I'm sorry, September of 2014. And in fact, Sage Smith's family has gone on the record as saying they feel a little upset by the fact that when Sage Smith went missing, she received very little coverage, whereas when Hannah Graham went missing, the whole entire world blew up. And in fact, Sage's sister was quoted as saying that she was working in a restaurant down on the downtown mall area where Hannah Graham had disappeared, and people were constantly coming in and asking, can we put up posters? Do you guys have surveillance footage? Do you have cameras? We've got to find this girl. And she said it just felt like such a slap in the face that her sister had received so little and Hannah Graham's coverage had received so much. And I can see why they would be quite unhappy with that. And really, I had to do a lot of digging on this case because I don't remember it getting this kind of coverage ever. In fact, the first I heard of it was when we were doing research for one of our True Crime Bookshelf episodes, and there was a whole long-form piece of reporting in a book that I had recommended about Sage Smith, and it was excellent reporting. But I realized, how have I never heard of this? It should have been big Virginia news. It wasn't.
I think the examples that you're highlighting, Kristin, can be good examples of missing white woman syndrome.
Yep.
Sage Smith is African-American, transgender. That case and her disappearance got very little publicity. With all due respect to everyone involved, the Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham cases both got a tremendous amount of publicity. In both examples, Morgan and Hannah are very pretty, young college students who went missing and whose bodies were later found and, of course, ultimately tied into Jesse Matthew, who was a predator, focused on a particular type of attractive, blonde, hopefully impaired young woman. And that's, he would troll these downtown bars and places where he would find these young college students who were out having a good time. Morgan attending a concert with Metallica, Hannah out with friends that evening on a bit of a bar hop, and he would look for these impaired young women. The families of Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham, whom we have nothing but wonderful things to say about, were able to use their communication skills to increase the visibility of their originally missing daughters' cases. Ultimately, of course, they both proved to be homicide cases. That didn't happen with Sage Smith. And I think this is a Virginia example of what we're seeing across the country, which is that people that are from more marginalized communities, like Sage Smith, an African-American transgender teen, not getting the kind of publicity that two young white college-age women attending prominent Virginia colleges received, all right around the same time.
Exactly. And as you were saying earlier, talking about the Showalter family and the amount of, I hesitate to say abuse by law enforcement. That's not quite right.
It's pretty close from what
It does sound pretty close. Sage Smith's family has said that they have received very little that is of help from the Charlottesville Police Department about this. They have repeatedly requested that the FBI brought in, and they have been told, we'll bring the FBI in when it's time. When's it time? She's been missing since 2012. When is it time? They've described as having just a very hard time getting, as you have always said, time, attention, and resources put into Sage Smith's case, and that's a tragedy.
Especially given the fact that Eric McFadden has likely blown town and has moved elsewhere in the country under a new name. This is a situation where the resources of the FBI could actually be quite helpful. Our hearts go out to the Smith family for the struggles that they are going through with law enforcement. And it is so difficult in a country where we have 200,000 unsolved cold case homicides across the country. It is so difficult to get that time, attention, and resources that are required to move a cold case like this forward. It's now been, coming up on 10 years since Sage Smith disappeared. I'm highly confident that Sage was murdered that night and that her body has been hidden somewhere and McFadden is in the wind.
Agreed. We will continue to explore the cases associated with the Route 29 stalker umbrella in upcoming episodes. We are, of course, going to be joined by our friend Kate Miles to talk about her book Trailed, which we are very much looking forward to. And we have several other episodes and guests up our sleeve with relation to these series of homicides. As always, we cannot thank you enough for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.